Sign here, Eleanor. It's the fastest way to move on, my ex-husband said as he slid the divorce papers across the polished conference table. 3 years later, that same man stood outside my office door waiting for permission to enter. But back then, I was a different woman. Back then, I still believed loyalty mattered. I still believed that after 38 years of marriage, kindness would count for something. The morning Thomas Hayes ended our marriage began like any other Tuesday. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window of the house we had shared for nearly 4 decades. I poured coffee into my favorite ceramic mug and listened to the familiar hum of the refrigerator. The house felt normal, safe, permanent. I had no idea that by sunset, none of it would belong to me anymore. Thomas arrived home that evening with a calm expression that immediately unsettled me. He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. If anything, he looked relieved. That frightened me more than shouting ever could have. He sat across from me at the dining room table where we had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and countless family dinners. Then he folded his hands and told me he wanted a divorce. Just like that. No warning. No discussion. No attempt to explain the years that suddenly seemed to mean nothing. I remember staring at the grain of the oak tabletop because looking directly at him felt impossible. My eyes eventually drifted toward the hallway, where framed photographs captured our entire life together. Vacations, Christmas mornings, family reunions, decades preserved behind glass. I wondered how many of those smiles had been real. Then he told me about Brianna. She was younger, ambitious, exciting, he said. He spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded reasonable, as though he were discussing a business decision instead of dismantling a life. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply listened. A week later, I sat inside a lawyer's office while documents were reviewed one page at a time. Thomas had always managed the finances. I trusted him completely. That trust turned out to be my greatest mistake. The settlement left me with very little. The house would be sold. Several. Accounts were already structured in ways I barely understood. By the time the paperwork was complete, I realized something terrifying. At 61 years old, I would be starting over with almost nothing. Friends I thought would support me slowly disappeared. Some sided with Thomas. Others simply didn't want to get involved. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls became less frequent. It was as though divorce had turned me into someone people no longer recognized. A month later, I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The living room was barely large enough for a couch and a coffee table. The kitchen could fit only one person comfortably. On my first night there, I sat on an unopened moving box and ate canned soup with a plastic spoon. The silence felt enormous. Every sound echoed. Every memory seemed louder than the room itself. Yet something unexpected happened during those lonely weeks. Once the shock faded, I began noticing things I had ignored for years. During our marriage, Thomas received credit for every success. But I had spent decades solving problems behind the scenes. I had managed schedules, negotiated contracts, organized budgets, calmed employees, and helped make critical decisions. I wasn't helpless. I had simply spent years convincing myself that my contributions didn't matter. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing old files I had saved from our business years earlier, I made a decision. If I could help build someone else's success, maybe I could build my own. I had no idea where that road would lead. I had no idea how many obstacles waited ahead. And I certainly had no idea that 3 years later, the man who walked away from me would walk back into my life, needing something only I could give. I spent the first few months learning how expensive loneliness could be. Every dollar mattered. Every decision carried weight. I had once lived in a 4-bedroom house with a landscaped backyard and a 3-car garage. Now I lived in an apartment where I could hear my neighbor's television through the wall every evening. At first, the contrast felt unbearable. I would wake up expecting to hear familiar sounds from my old life, only to remember where I was. The realization arrived fresh every morning. Some days it felt like grief. Other days it felt like embarrassment. I found part-time work at a small office supply store about 4 miles from my apartment. The pay was modest, but it covered groceries and helped me avoid dipping into the little savings I had left. Most customers never looked at me twice. I was simply another older woman restocking shelves and helping people find printer paper. Oddly enough, I found comfort in that. Nobody knew my history. Nobody knew what I had lost. During lunch breaks, I would sit alone in the employee break room with a sandwich packed from home. While others scrolled through their phones, I often found myself thinking about the years I spent helping Thomas build his company. Back then, I had never considered those experiences valuable. I had viewed them as part of being a supportive wife. But the more I reflected, the more details returned. I remembered negotiating lower vendor costs when cash flow was tight. I remembered calming frustrated employees before they resigned. I remembered reorganizing entire departments after unexpected turnover. One memory led to another. Soon I began keeping notes in a small notebook I carried everywhere. At night, I sat at my kitchen table and filled pages with lessons learned from nearly 4 decades around business operations. The notebook grew thicker each week. Around that time, an old acquaintance named Carol called unexpectedly. She had worked with Thomas years earlier and had recently started a small manufacturing company. She was struggling with staffing issues and asked if I had any suggestions. We met for coffee at a diner near the interstate. What was supposed to be a 30-minute conversation lasted almost 3 hours. I listened carefully, asked questions, and outlined a few practical solutions. 2 months later, Carol called again. Her employee retention problems had improved significantly. She wanted to pay me for additional consulting. I nearly laughed when she made the offer. Nobody had ever paid me for advice before. Yet there I was, sitting in my tiny apartment, receiving my first consulting check. It was not a large amount of money, but I kept staring at it anyway. The number itself was not important. What mattered was what it represented. For the first time since my divorce, I saw evidence that my experience had value beyond my marriage. Word traveled slowly. Carol mentioned me to another business owner. That owner recommended me to someone else. Small projects began appearing one after another. None of them made headlines. None transformed my life overnight. But each one added a little more confidence, a little more stability, a little more hope. Meanwhile, I occasionally heard updates about Thomas through mutual acquaintances. He and Brianna were still enjoying the attention that came with success. They attended charity events, appeared in local business magazines, and shared photographs from luxury vacations. Whenever someone mentioned them, I nodded politely and changed the subject. I no longer wanted to know what they were doing. My focus had shifted elsewhere. Every evening, I returned to my apartment, opened my notebook, and worked until midnight. Slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing, I was building something entirely my own. As my consulting work expanded, I began noticing something that had escaped me for years. The most valuable thing I had gained from my marriage was not the lifestyle, the house, or the social connections. It was knowledge. For nearly 4 decades, I had been sitting in meeting rooms, reviewing reports, listening to negotiations, and solving problems. At the time, I never viewed those experiences as an education. I was simply helping. Looking back, I realized I had received a front-row seat to the inner workings of dozens of businesses. The difference was that Thomas always stood in the spotlight while I remained in the background. One evening, after finishing a project for a regional distributor, I opened an old storage box I had carried with me through every move. Inside were notebooks, calendars, planning documents, and handwritten records dating back years. I spent hours sorting through them. Every page seemed to unlock another memory. I remembered a supplier crisis that threatened to shut down operations for weeks. I remembered creating a scheduling system that improved productivity without increasing labor costs. I remembered helping a struggling department manager rebuild trust with employees after a difficult period. None of those accomplishments had my name attached to them, yet they had happened because I was there. That realization changed something inside me. For the first time, I stopped thinking of myself as someone rebuilding after loss. I started thinking of myself as someone finally stepping into her own identity. The next morning, I invested part of my consulting income into a simple website. Nothing flashy, just a professional page explaining my services and experience. I chose the name Hayes Business Solutions because I wanted to reclaim the surname that had once felt like a burden. If I was going to build something new, I would build it on my own terms. Weeks passed, then months. New clients arrived steadily. Some owned family businesses. Others managed manufacturing companies, transportation firms, and retail operations. I listened carefully to their challenges. Most problems were surprisingly similar. Poor communication, inefficient systems, high employee turnover. I had spent years solving those issues without recognition. Now people were hiring me specifically because I knew how to solve them. The income gradually increased. I moved from my tiny apartment into a slightly larger one across town. The second bedroom became my office. It was not luxurious. The desk was secondhand. The bookshelves came from a discount furniture store. But every item in that room represented something important. I had earned it myself. Around that time, I attended a local business networking event. Standing in that crowded ballroom felt strange. 3 years earlier, I had attended similar events as someone's wife. This time I was there as the owner of my own company. The difference was impossible to ignore. Several business owners recognized my name from referrals. A few even approached me first. As conversations unfolded, I noticed something else. People listened when I spoke. They respected my opinions. They valued my experience. Nobody cared about my divorce. Nobody cared about my age. They cared about results. Driving home that night, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Confidence. Not the fragile confidence that depends on another person's approval. Real confidence. The kind that comes from proving something to yourself. Meanwhile, without realizing it, I was beginning to enter the same professional circles where Thomas still operated. Our paths had not crossed yet, but they were moving closer with every passing month. The 4th year of my new life began with a phone call that changed everything. I was sitting in my office early on a Monday morning reviewing reports from 3 different clients when a representative from a national consulting group contacted me. At first, I assumed they had the wrong person. Companies of that size did not usually call someone who had started with a second-hand desk in a spare bedroom. Yet the conversation continued for nearly an hour. They had been following my work. Several businesses I had helped were showing measurable improvements. Productivity was higher. Employee retention had improved. Revenue was growing. More importantly, the people running those companies trusted me. By the end of the call, they invited me to discuss a partnership opportunity. I remember staring out the office window after hanging up. The parking lot below looked exactly the same as it had the day before, but something felt different. For years, I had been focused on surviving. Then I had focused on rebuilding. Without realizing it, I had reached a point where new possibilities were appearing faster than I could anticipate them. Over the following months, meetings filled my calendar. Some were virtual, others required travel. I flew to Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, and Denver. Every airport terminal reminded me how much my life had changed. 3 years earlier, I had worried about grocery bills and rent payments. Now I was discussing expansion strategies with executives responsible for thousands of employees. What surprised me most was how comfortable I felt. I was no longer pretending to belong in those rooms. I belonged there. One afternoon, after a long meeting in Dallas, I reviewed industry reports during my flight home. That was when I noticed Thomas's company mentioned in a financial publication. The article was brief, but the details caught my attention immediately. Revenue had declined. Key contracts had not been renewed. Leadership changes were creating uncertainty. I read the article twice. Then I closed the magazine and placed it back into the seat pocket. I felt no satisfaction, no anger, just quiet curiosity. Over the next several months, similar reports continued appearing. Industry contacts mentioned operational problems. Vendors were becoming cautious. Longtime employees were leaving. The company that once seemed untouchable was beginning to show cracks. Meanwhile, my own business continued growing. The National Consulting Group eventually offered an acquisition agreement that exceeded anything I had imagined when I first started. The negotiations lasted weeks. Lawyers reviewed documents. Accountants examined financial records. Every step felt surreal. The woman who once ate canned soup alone in a tiny apartment was now negotiating terms with a corporation operating across multiple states. The agreement was finalized on a bright spring morning. After signing the final documents, I walked outside and sat on a bench overlooking a small lake near the corporate campus. The breeze moved gently across the water. For a long time, I simply sat there thinking, not about Thomas, not about the divorce, not about everything I had lost. I thought about resilience, about second chances, about how easily people underestimate someone who quietly keeps moving forward. A few weeks later, I officially stepped into a senior leadership position within the newly expanded organization. New responsibilities arrived immediately. New opportunities followed. Then one morning, during a routine executive briefing, a hiring manager mentioned an experienced applicant seeking employment after a recent corporate collapse. I barely paid attention at first. Then she said the name, Thomas Hayes. For several seconds, I thought I had misheard her. The conference room remained quiet as the hiring manager continued reviewing candidate information, but I barely heard another word. Thomas. Hayes. The name sat heavily in my mind. 3 years had passed since our divorce, yet seeing those two words together again felt strangely unreal. I asked for a copy of the application package after the meeting ended. My voice remained calm, professional. Nobody in the room noticed anything unusual. Once I returned to my office, I closed the door and opened the file. The photograph was recent. Thomas looked older than I remembered. The confidence that had once defined him seemed diminished. There was a weariness around his eyes that had not been there before. I continued reading. His former company had officially ceased operations 6 months earlier. Several major contracts had been lost. Revenue had declined steadily. Attempts to secure new financing had failed. The collapse had happened gradually, then all at once. I sat back in my chair and stared out the window. Years earlier, news like this might have brought me satisfaction. Instead, I felt something closer to perspective. Life had taken both of us down roads neither of us expected. The difference was that when my world fell apart, I had accepted responsibility for rebuilding it. According to the file in front of me, Thomas had spent the last several months moving from interview to interview without success. Later that week, I learned more through industry contacts. Many executives remembered his reputation. Some admired his past accomplishments. Others remembered stories about his management style and leadership decisions. The business community could be surprisingly small. People talked. Patterns were remembered. Decisions carried consequences long after the original events disappeared. Meanwhile, my responsibilities continued expanding. The acquisition had exceeded expectations. New clients were arriving faster than projected. Departments were growing. Teams were hiring. Every day brought fresh challenges. Ironically, some of the strategies driving our success were methods I had quietly developed years ago while helping Thomas navigate his own business difficulties. The difference was that now those ideas carried my name. One afternoon, the hiring manager stopped by my office. She placed a folder on my desk and explained that Thomas had advanced to the final stage of consideration for a senior operations role. His experience remained impressive despite recent setbacks. Several executives supported moving forward with an interview. She wanted my approval before scheduling the meeting. I opened the folder again. This time I paid attention to the cover letter. The tone surprised me. Gone was the certainty I remembered so well. In its place was humility. He wrote about lessons learned, mistakes made, opportunities lost. The words felt sincere. Whether they truly were, I could not yet know. I signed the approval form and handed it back. The hiring manager smiled and thanked me before leaving. After the door closed, silence settled over the office. I looked around the room that had become the center of a life I built myself. The framed awards, the strategic plans, the photographs from company events. Every inch of this success had been earned one difficult step at a time. Soon, for the first time in 3 years, I would see Thomas again. Not as a wife, not as someone seeking answers, not as someone asking to be valued. This time, our positions would be very different. And neither of us yet understood how much that meeting was about to change. The interview was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. I arrived at the office earlier than usual that day, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted time to think. The city skyline stretched beyond the windows of my office, glowing beneath a clear spring sky. Employees moved through the building carrying laptops, coffee cups, and meeting agendas. It looked like any other business day, yet I knew something unusual was about to happen. 3 years earlier, I had walked into a lawyer's office believing my future was being decided by someone else. Now I sat in a corner office where important decisions crossed my desk every day. Life had a strange way of changing direction when you least expected it. Around 9:45, I reviewed Thomas's application one final time. His qualifications remained strong despite everything that had happened. Decades of experience, leadership positions, industry knowledge. On paper, he still looked impressive. But resumes only told part of the story. Character mattered too. Judgment mattered. The ability to adapt mattered. Those qualities rarely appeared in neat bullet points. At exactly 10 o'clock, my assistant called. The candidate had arrived. I thanked her and stood. For a moment, I looked at my reflection in the office window. The woman staring back at me seemed very different from the person who had once sat alone in a tiny apartment wondering how she would survive. Then I walked toward the executive conference room. The hiring committee had already gathered. Several department leaders sat around the table reviewing notes. None of them knew about my personal history with the applicant. I had deliberately kept that information private. This meeting needed to remain professional, fair, objective. A few minutes later, the door opened. Thomas stepped inside. The change in his expression happened instantly. First came routine confidence, then recognition, then complete disbelief. He stopped moving. For several seconds, nobody spoke. I remained seated at the far end of the table. Calm, professional. Thomas looked directly at me as if trying to determine whether what he was seeing could possibly be real. The room remained silent long enough for everyone else to notice the tension. Finally, one of the executives welcomed him and invited him to take a seat. Thomas complied, though his movements seemed slower than before. Throughout the interview, he answered questions carefully. His experience was evident. His knowledge remained impressive, yet I could sense that part of his attention never left me. Every so often, his eyes drifted in my direction. Not with anger, not even with embarrassment, more like confusion, as though he was trying to understand how the future he had imagined had somehow become this reality instead. The interview lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, the committee thanked him for his time. Thomas stood and gathered his documents. Before leaving, he looked directly at me again. This time there was no confusion, only recognition. Recognition of what had happened. Recognition of who I had become. Recognition that the woman he once underestimated now occupied a position he never imagined she could reach. After the door closed behind him, the room remained quiet. One executive finally broke the silence by commenting on the strength of the candidate's qualifications. Others agreed. The discussion continued professionally, objectively. Yet while everyone debated hiring recommendations, one thought continued echoing in my mind. 3 years ago, Thomas believed he was closing a chapter of his life. He had no idea he was actually opening mine. The hiring committee spent the next several days evaluating candidates, and Thomas remained at the center of every discussion. His experience made him difficult to ignore. Several executives believed he could contribute immediately. Others expressed concern about the circumstances surrounding the collapse of his former company. I listened carefully without revealing more than necessary. Every opinion deserved consideration. Every decision required fairness. Yet beneath the professional conversations, I could not stop thinking about the expression on Thomas's face when he walked into that conference room. It had not been arrogance. It had not been resentment. It had been shock. The kind of shock that comes when reality refuses to follow the story you expected life to tell. Late one afternoon, I was finishing paperwork when my assistant informed me that someone was waiting in the reception area. She sounded uncertain. When I asked who it was, she hesitated before answering. Thomas. For a moment, I considered declining the meeting. There was no business reason for a private conversation. Everything that needed to be discussed should happen through official channels. Yet something told me avoiding the encounter would solve nothing. I agreed to see him for a few minutes. When he entered my office, the contrast between our last meeting and this one was impossible to ignore. Years ago, he had sat across from me at our dining room table and explained why he wanted a different future. Now he stood quietly near the doorway of an office inside a company where I held authority. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. He told me I looked well. I thanked him. He glanced around the office before admitting that he never expected to see me in a position like this. The statement was not insulting. In fact, it sounded painfully honest. For most of our marriage, he had viewed me through a narrow lens. Wife, supporter, helper, someone dependable but invisible. He had never imagined that the skills he overlooked could become the foundation of something much larger. The conversation remained polite, professional. Then Thomas surprised me. He apologized, not with dramatic speeches or emotional displays, just a simple acknowledgement that he had underestimated me. He admitted he had spent years believing his success belonged entirely to him. Losing everything had forced him to reconsider many assumptions. I listened without interrupting. Part of me had imagined this moment before. During the hardest months after the divorce, I had pictured what it might feel like if he ever understood the damage he caused. Yet standing there in reality, the moment felt different than I expected. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only clarity. I realized I no longer needed anything from him. Not validation, not regret, not even an apology. My life had moved beyond those needs. Before leaving, Thomas asked a question that lingered with me long after the door closed behind him. He wanted to know how I had done it, how I had rebuilt everything after losing so much. I thought about that question for a long time. The answer was surprisingly simple. I stopped waiting for someone else to recognize my value. The next morning, the hiring committee gathered one final time. The discussion would determine whether Thomas Hayes received an offer. As the meeting began, every person around the table looked toward me, knowing my recommendation would carry significant weight. What none of them realized was that the decision I was about to make had very little to do with the past and everything to do with the person I had become. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Executives reviewed qualifications, discussed organizational needs, and compared candidates one final time. Throughout the discussion, I remained focused on the same principle that had guided every major decision since rebuilding my life. Fairness mattered. Results mattered. Personal history could not become the deciding factor. When the conversation finally ended, the committee reached a conclusion. Thomas would receive an offer, not because of sympathy, not because of our past, because his experience matched the role and because the team believed he could contribute. After the decision was finalized, several executives left the room. I stayed behind for a few minutes, reviewing notes and organizing documents. Strangely, I felt lighter than I had expected. For years, I imagined what true closure might look like. I used to think it would involve some dramatic moment where everything balanced perfectly. Instead, closure arrived quietly through a simple realization. I was no longer making decisions based on old wounds. A few days later, Thomas returned to headquarters to discuss final employment details. The meeting was routine. Human resources handled most of the process. Still, he requested a brief conversation with me afterward. I agreed. When he entered my office, he seemed calmer than before. There was still uncertainty in his expression, but something else had appeared as well. Gratitude. He thanked me for giving him a fair opportunity. Then he surprised me again. He admitted that after losing his company, he spent months blaming everyone around him. Market conditions, competitors, former employees, circumstances. It took a long time before he accepted his own role in what happened. Success had convinced him he was always right. Failure forced him to examine choices he had avoided for years. We talked longer than either of us expected. Not as former spouses revisiting old arguments. Not as enemies settling scores. Simply as two people whose lives had taken very different paths. During that conversation, I learned that Brianna had left shortly after the company began experiencing serious financial trouble. There was no bitterness in the way he described it. Only acceptance. Life had moved on for both of them. As the discussion continued, Thomas looked around my office once more. His eyes paused on framed photographs. From company events, leadership conferences, and community projects. Evidence of a life built piece by piece over several difficult years. Finally, he asked the same question again. How had I managed to keep going when everything seemed lost? This time I gave him a fuller answer. I told him that rebuilding did not happen because I was fearless. It happened because I was afraid and moved forward anyway. There were nights when I doubted myself. Months when progress felt invisible. Times when I wanted someone else to rescue me. But eventually I realized that waiting for rescue only delayed recovery. The turning point came when I stopped focusing on what had been taken from me and started focusing on what remained. My knowledge, my experience, my determination. Those things never disappeared. They simply waited for me to recognize them. Thomas listened quietly. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Then he said something I never expected to hear. He told me that losing me had been the worst business decision and the worst personal decision of his life. Years earlier, words like those would have meant everything. Now they simply felt like the truth arriving late. As he stood to leave, I noticed something remarkable. For the first time since seeing him again, I felt no sadness at all, only peace. The months that followed brought a sense of normalcy I had not experienced in years. Thomas joined the organization and settled into his role. We interacted occasionally during leadership meetings and company events, but the dynamic had changed completely. There were no lingering arguments, no unresolved questions. The past no longer controlled either of us. We were simply two professionals moving forward with separate lives. What surprised me most was how little I thought about revenge. During the darkest days after my divorce, I imagined success would feel like proving something to the people who had underestimated me. I believed achievement would somehow erase the pain. But real healing turned out to be much quieter than that. It arrived through ordinary moments. Morning coffee in an office I had earned. Conversations with colleagues who respected my work. The satisfaction of helping businesses grow and employees succeed. Those things mattered far more than any fantasy of vindication. One afternoon, nearly a year after Thomas joined the company, I received an invitation to speak at a regional business conference. Hundreds of entrepreneurs and executives would attend. The organizers wanted me to share the story of rebuilding a career later in life. Standing backstage before the event began, I reflected on how impossible that moment would have seemed a few years earlier. Back then, I had been sitting alone in a small apartment wondering how I would pay next month's bills. Now people wanted to hear my perspective, not because of who I had married, not because of who I had lost, because of what I had built. During the presentation, I spoke honestly about setbacks, resilience, and second chances. I explained that success rarely happens overnight. Most transformations occur quietly, one decision at a time, one difficult day at a time, one act of perseverance at a time. When the session ended, audience members lined up to ask questions. Many were women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. Some were facing divorce. Others were rebuilding after job losses, health challenges, or personal disappointments. Again and again, I heard the same fear. They believed it was too late. I smiled every time and told them the truth. It is never too late to discover your own value. Several weeks later, I encountered Thomas after a leadership meeting. We walked toward the parking garage together. As we reached the elevators, he stopped and thanked me. Not for the job, not for the opportunity. He thanked me for showing him that people can change, that rebuilding is possible. I appreciated the sentiment, but I also knew something important. His journey belonged to him. Mine belonged to me. We stepped into separate elevators and headed in different directions. Watching the doors close, I realized there was nothing left to prove. The greatest victory was never becoming more successful than someone who had hurt me. It was learning that my worth had never depended on another person's opinion in the first place. Years earlier, I lost a marriage, a home, and the future I thought I wanted. What I gained turned out to be far more valuable. Confidence, independence, purpose, and perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that no matter how much life changes, it is always possible to begin again. That was the real ending to my story. Not revenge, not regret, just a woman who finally understood her own strength.